Welcome back to Creepy Corner Stories, where the ordinary turns sinister and the familiar becomes frightful. Tonight, we're stepping into a realm that hits uncomfortably close to home. Neighbor horror stories. They're the people we pass in the hallway, wave to across the street, or borrow sugar from. But what happens when the ones living just a wall away aren't as harmless as they seem? From eerie sounds in the night to unsettling secrets lurking behind closed doors, these tales will make you rethink how well you really know the person next door. So lock your doors, close your curtains, and settle in. Because tonight, we're uncovering the terrifying truths of neighbor nightmares. Let's begin. Story: The Man in the Basement. A young woman named Emma moved into her first apartment. It was a small but cozy space in a quiet building. Her only neighbor was an older man named Mr. Parker, who lived directly below her. He seemed friendly at first, always smiling and saying hello when they crossed paths. But soon, Emma started noticing strange things. At night, she would hear faint noises from below, scraping sounds, heavy footsteps, and what sounded like muffled talking, even though Mr. Parker lived alone. She brushed it off, thinking he was watching TV late at night or moving furniture. One evening, Emma was doing laundry in the basement, which was shared by all the tenants. She noticed that one of the basement doors was slightly open, and inside was a small room filled with old furniture, boxes, and a faint, musty smell. Just as she was about to leave, she spotted something odd: a large knife lying on the floor near the corner of the room. Emma's heart raced, but she convinced herself it must have been left there by a worker or the landlord. Still, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The next night, things got stranger. As she was falling asleep, Emma heard knocking, soft but deliberate, coming from her bedroom floor, directly above Mr. Parker's apartment. She froze, listening carefully. It wasn't random, it sounded like someone tapping in a pattern. The following morning, Emma decided to ask Mr. Parker about the noise. She knocked on his door, but there was no answer. His blinds were drawn, and his mailbox was overflowing. It seemed like he hadn't been home in days, but she could still hear noises from his apartment at night. Growing more uneasy, Emma told her landlord about the sounds and the knife in the basement. He promised to check it out, but nothing came of it. Days turned into weeks, and the noises continued. One night, Emma woke up to the sound of her front door handle jiggling. She was terrified and called the police immediately. When the officers arrived, they searched the building and found something horrifying. Mr. Parker hadn't been living in his apartment for weeks. He had been staying in the basement, hiding behind that partially open door Emma had seen. Inside the basement, they found a makeshift, empty food containers and a notebook filled with disturbing writings about Emma. What time she left for work, when she returned, and even details about her daily routine. The knife she had seen earlier? It was found under his makeshift bed. Mr. Parker was arrested that night. It turned out he had been evicted months earlier but refused to leave the building. Instead, he stayed hidden in the basement, watching Emma and waiting for the right moment to strike. Emma moved out shortly after, haunted by the thought of how close she had been to danger. She never heard from Mr. Parker again, but the fear of what could have happened stayed with her forever. Story: The Room Next Door. A college student named Lily moved into a small apartment building near her campus. It wasn't fancy, but it was affordable and close to her classes. She was excited to have her own space. The building was quiet, and her neighbors mostly kept to themselves. The apartment next to hers was rented by a man in his 40s named Jack. He seemed friendly at first, always smiling and making small talk when they passed each other in the hallway. But soon, Jack's behavior started to change. At first, Lily noticed small things. Jack would always be outside his door whenever she came home. He would stand there, pretending to be on his phone or organizing his keys, but it was obvious he was waiting for her. One night, she heard a strange noise coming from the shared wall between their apartments. It sounded like scratching, almost as if someone was running their nails along the wall. She thought maybe it was mice, so she tried to ignore it. But the noises didn't stop. They grew louder and happened almost every night. Then one evening, Lily was walking to her door when she noticed something chilling. Jack's apartment door was slightly open and she could see inside. On the wall that they shared, there were several small holes drilled into the plaster. Her stomach turned as she realized the holes were aimed directly at her bedroom. Panicking, Lily called her friend for help. Together, they went to the building manager and demanded he come check it out. The manager unlocked Jack's apartment while Jack wasn't home. What they found made Lily's blood run cold. The walls of Jack's apartment were covered in photos of Lily. Photos taken through the holes in the wall. Some showed her sleeping, studying, and even getting dressed. There was also a notebook filled with creepy notes about her, including details about what time she came and left the apartment, what she wore, and where she went. The police were called immediately. When they searched further, they found a hidden camera in one of the holes, aimed directly at her bed. Jack had been spying on Lily for months without her knowing. Jack was arrested later that night. Lily moved out of the building the next day, unable to sleep knowing what had been happening right next door. Story: The Smell from Next Door. Samantha had just moved into a small apartment in a busy city. She was thrilled to start fresh, and the building seemed perfect. Quiet, clean, and filled with friendly neighbors. The apartment next to hers was occupied by a man named Tom, who kept to himself. Samantha barely saw him, but she figured he was just a private person. A few weeks after moving in, Samantha started noticing a strange smell. It was faint at first, like old garbage, but it grew stronger every day. The smell seemed to be coming from Tom's apartment. Samantha thought maybe he had forgotten to take out his trash, so she tried to ignore it. But the smell only got worse. It became so overpowering that she couldn't eat in her own apartment. She tried knocking on Tom's door to let him know, but there was no answer. The door looked locked and untouched. One night, Samantha heard loud banging sounds from Tom's apartment, followed by a dragging noise. She pressed her ear to the wall, but everything went silent again. Chills ran down her spine, but she convinced herself it was nothing. The next day, Samantha reported the smell and noises to the landlord. He promised to check it out. Hours later, Samantha saw him leaving Tom's apartment, looking pale and shaken. He told her everything was fine, but his tone suggested otherwise. The smell continued to worsen, and now Samantha began hearing whispers at night. Low, soft voices that seemed to come from the vents. Terrified, she called the police and reported her concerns. When the police arrived and forced their way into Tom's apartment, what they found was horrifying. The apartment was empty, except for a chair, a small table, and a mattress. On the mattress lay a body. Tom's. He had been dead for over 2 weeks. But that wasn't the scariest part. The police discovered that someone else had been living in the apartment after Tom's death. A hidden door in the back closet led to an old maintenance shaft, and inside the shaft were a sleeping bag, food wrappers, and a notebook. The notebook contained details about Samantha, what she ate, when she slept, and even what she wore. Whoever had been living there had slipped away just before the police arrived. To this day, Samantha doesn't know who they were, but she moved out of the building immediately, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Story: The Locked Apartment. Megan moved into a large apartment complex, thrilled to start her new job in the city. Her neighbors seemed nice, except for the apartment directly across from hers. It was always dark, and no one ever came or went. The landlord told her an older man named Mr. Harris lived there but was quiet and private. At first, Megan thought nothing of it. But strange things started happening. Late at night, she would hear faint noises coming from the hallway, soft whispers, the sound of slow footsteps, and occasionally what sounded like faint tapping on her door. One evening, as she returned home from work, she noticed something strange. The door to Mr. Harris's apartment was slightly open. She hesitated but decided to peek inside, calling out, "Hello?" The apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, just a thick layer of dust and an eerie silence. Confused, Megan asked her landlord about it. He shrugged and said, "Mr. Harris moved out months ago. No one's rented that unit since." Her blood ran cold. If the apartment was empty, then who was making those noises? The next night, Megan was woken by a loud noise. someone pounding on her door. She froze, heart racing, and grabbed her phone. When she checked the peephole, no one was there, but a piece of paper was shoved under her door. It was a note, written in shaky handwriting, "Stop looking." Terrified, Megan called the police. When they arrived, they searched the empty apartment across the hall. Inside, they found a pile of old blankets, food wrappers, and something far worse, a small notebook filled with pages of detailed notes about Megan. What time she left, what time she came home, and even what she wore each day. The police said someone had been living there illegally, watching her the entire time. The person was never found, but Megan moved out the next morning, unable to stay in a place where she had been under constant surveillance. Story: The Woman in the Hall. Julie lived in a small apartment building with just 6 units. It was old and a bit creaky, but the rent was cheap, and most of the neighbors kept to themselves. Everyone, that is, except for the woman in 3B. The woman's name was Rose, and she was odd. She was quiet during the day, but could often be heard pacing the halls late at night, muttering to herself. Julie thought maybe Rose had trouble sleeping, but her mutterings grew louder and more unsettling. One night, Julie was coming home late from work when she saw Rose standing in the hallway outside her apartment. Rose was staring at the wall, whispering something Julie couldn't make out. Julie tried to quietly slip past her, but as she did, Rose turned her head sharply and said, "They're watching you too, you know." Julie froze. "Who's watching me?" she asked nervously. Rose smiled, her teeth yellowed and uneven. "The ones in the walls," she whispered. Julie laughed it off as a creepy but harmless comment. She avoided Rose after that, but things started to get strange. Late at night, Julie began hearing scratching sounds behind her bedroom walls. At first, she thought it might be mice, but the noises were too loud, almost deliberate. Sometimes it sounded like soft tapping, as if someone or something was trying to communicate. One evening, Julie was cleaning her apartment when she noticed something odd. On the wall near her bed, there was a small hole, no bigger than the tip of a pencil. She peered through it but saw only darkness. Feeling unnerved, she covered the hole with tape and went to bed. That night, she woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from the wall where she had covered the hole. Heart racing, she pressed her ear against the wall. "I see you," a voice whispered from the other side. Julie screamed and called the landlord, demanding an explanation. The landlord reluctantly admitted that Rose had been complaining for months about voices in the walls, but he had always dismissed it as delusions. The next day, workers came to inspect the walls. What they found was horrifying. Someone had carved out a small crawl space between the apartments and had been living there. Inside, they found a mattress, piles of trash, and a notebook filled with disturbing notes about Julie and other tenants. The police were called, but whoever had been living in the walls had already fled. Julie moved out immediately, unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched, even after she left. Story: The Strange Tenant Upstairs. Mark had just moved into a modest apartment in an old building. The place was quiet, except for the tenant upstairs. Every night, around midnight, he heard strange noises, heavy footsteps pacing back and forth, furniture being dragged, and sometimes faint sobbing. At first, Mark thought the tenant was just a night owl, but the noises began to bother him. He mentioned it to the landlord, who simply shrugged and said, "Oh, that's Mrs. Wilkins. She's lived here for years," keeps to herself. Curious, Mark decided to introduce himself. One afternoon, he went upstairs and knocked on her door. No one answered. He knocked again, but still nothing. Thinking she might not be home, he left. That night, the noises returned, louder than ever. Mark banged on his ceiling with a broom, hoping Mrs. Wilkins would quiet down. Instead, the noises stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. The next morning, Mark ran into an older neighbor named Mr. Carter. He asked him about Mrs. Wilkins. Mr. Carter frowned. "Mrs. Wilkins? She doesn't live there anymore. She passed away about 5 years ago. Didn't the landlord tell you?" Mark's stomach dropped. "That can't be right. I hear her every night, walking, moving furniture." Mr. Carter's face went pale. "That's impossible. After she died, no one's lived in that apartment. It's been locked ever since." Determined to prove the noises were real, Mark went to the landlord and demanded to see the apartment. Reluctantly, the landlord agreed and unlocked the door. The apartment was completely empty. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture was still draped in old white sheets. Mark stood in the silent room, his skin crawling. As they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed above them. Both men froze, staring at each other in disbelief. "Is there an attic?" Mark whispered. The landlord shook his head. "No, the top floor ends here." The footsteps grew louder, pacing directly above their heads. Mark didn't wait to find out more. He packed his things that night and left the building, leaving behind the haunting mystery of Mrs. Wilkins's empty apartment. Story: The Silent Watcher. Rachel was thrilled to move into her new house. It was in a quiet neighborhood, perfect for her to start fresh after a tough year. Her next-door neighbor, Mr. Grayson, was an older man who kept to himself. Rachel rarely saw him, but occasionally caught glimpses of him standing by his window, staring out into her yard. At first, she thought nothing of it. She assumed he was just a lonely man passing the time. But as weeks went by, it became clear that Mr. Grayson wasn't just staring out the window. He was staring at her. No matter what time of day, whenever Rachel looked over, she would see him there, motionless, watching her. It started to make her uneasy. She tried to wave a few times to be polite, but he never waved back. One night, Rachel was taking out the trash when she heard something rustling in the bushes near her fence. She froze, scanning the dark yard, but saw nothing. As she turned to go back inside, she noticed Mr. Grayson's face in his window, illuminated by the faint glow of his house lights. He was still, his eyes fixed on her. The next day, Rachel decided to confront him. She walked over and knocked on his door, but there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, and called out, "Mr. Grayson?" Still, nothing. Later that evening, Rachel was in her living room when she noticed something odd. Mr. Grayson's window was dark, but she could just barely make out the silhouette of someone standing there. She closed her curtains and tried to shake the feeling of being watched. That night, she woke up to the sound of her door creaking. Her heart pounded as she sat up in bed, straining to hear. From the corner of her room, she thought she saw movement, just the faintest shadow. Grabbing her phone, she turned on the flashlight and scanned the room. Nothing was there. She bolted out of bed and checked all the locks in her house. Everything was secure. The next morning, Rachel called the police to report the strange occurrences. When they arrived, she mentioned her neighbor, Mr. Grayson, and his unsettling behavior. One of the officers looked confused. "Mr. Grayson? Ma'am, no one's lived in that house for over a year. The owner passed away, and the place has been empty ever since." Rachel's blood ran cold. She insisted they check the house, and when they did, they found it dusty, abandoned, and completely empty. Except for one thing. In the living room, facing the window that looked directly into Rachel's yard, was a single chair. On the chair sat a doll, dressed in a tattered suit, with its head tilted slightly to the side as if watching. Rachel didn't stay long enough to find out how it got there. She moved out the very next day, leaving behind the eerie memory of the silent watcher. Thanks for watching Creepy Corner Stories. If you enjoyed these spine-chilling tales, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Got a scary story of your own? Drop it in the comments below.